Welcome once again to SoCo Chat, a podcast where we discuss all things concerning this beautiful place we call home, the County of Sonoma. I'm your host, Paul Gullickson, Communications Manager for the county. Today, our topic is land development, planning, construction concerning the unincorporated areas of the County of Sonoma, which is overseen by a department known as Permit Sonoma. And we are very grateful to have as our guest today, Permit Sonoma Director, Tennis Wick. We want to talk with Tennis about the department's wide range of coverage and programs, including the county's general plan, which is about to be updated, the tree ordinance, fire prevention, a number of things. But before we do, we'd like to remind you, our viewers and listeners, about our weekly trivia question. At the end of today's segment, I'll let you know the trivia question for this week and how you can submit your answer, so stay tuned. But the first to the first to answer today's SoCo Chat question will receive one of our SoCo Chat coffee mugs, so you don't want to miss that. So anyway, once again, Tennis Wick, thank you for being with us today.
Great. Thanks for having me here, Paul.
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned, you are Director of Permit Sonoma, which used to be known as the Permit and Resource Management Division, which is a mouthful. Can you help listeners understand all that your department does for the unincorporated areas of the county?
Sure. We have a rather broad mandate of balancing environmental protection with sustainable development. So obviously that touches and concerns all matters in land use.
Yeah. Yeah, well, we're going to get into some of those that broad spectrum that you just talked about. But can you give people a sense of how big your department is?
Currently, we have about 200 employees, split among 6 different divisions.
Yeah,
about 22 different licenses under the roof.
Mm-hmm.
So the joy of this organization is each one brings a culture, and the challenge of this experience is that each one brings its own culture.
Right.
So my job as leader is to make sure each one of them is supported and that they work well together.
Yeah. Well, it's a big task, and we're going to dive more into that. But before we do, I want to talk a little bit about your background. I want listeners to know a few things about Tennis Wick. Yeah, I know. Is right. This is really interesting. You have a Bachelor of Arts degree. Correct me if I'm wrong about any of this, but you have a Bachelor of Arts degree in political science with a public service emphasis from UCSB, Santa Barbara. Is that right?
Proud gaucho.
Yeah, there you go. You also have a law degree from Golden Gate State University School of Law.
Correct.
And at one time, you were a partner at the engineering and planning consulting firm known as CSW Stuber Stroh Engineering Group. Is that right?
Yes, great group. Primarily civil engineers that put up with a planner for almost a decade.
And so, but then you were there, and then you began your public service career working at the County of Sonoma, Marin. Is that right?
No, actually, so I'd worked with the County of Marin first, straight out of law school.
Okay.
When I was in law school, instead of clerking with a judge, I worked with Dean Macris, who is the director of city planning for San Francisco. He had 3 of us who were in law school that worked. I was part of the housing team and really got hooked. And so right out of graduation from Golden Gate, I went to work for the County of Marin for about 10 years. Had the ignoble title of development chief, even though most of what I did was deny development. And Dietz Stroh said, I'm tired of you denying our projects. Why don't you come learn what design is all about?
On this side.
Yep. And so he said, if you're going to come here and be partner, you have to know physical design.
Wow.
So they took me through a physical design regimen. I went through a lot of electronic erasers, but it was some of the best education I ever received.
Well, it's fascinating because you have a lot of experience on both sides of the table. You know what it's like to be a planner and a designer, to come to a public agency and wanting to get your permits, and now you know the other side of the table as well, and you also know the law and the political theory.
And very, very fortunate to be a customer of then PRMD, Permit and Resource Management Department, for at least 10 years before joining it.
So you had that experience. You know what
Permit Center.
Yeah.
waiting for my permit.
Well, in addition to all that, you are a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners and the American Planning Association. You also have experience as a member of the Planning Commission in Petaluma.
Yeah, a couple terms.
A couple of terms where you are still a resident and
Mm-hmm.
a beloved member of the community. You are board
Depends on
president.
who you ask.
I'm telling you, I did the background check. You're a past board or current board president of the Friends of the Petaluma River?
Past
Board, and the Petaluma People's Service Center and the Petaluma Area Chamber of Commerce, right?
Yeah, it's a very civically active community.
Well, you must have a lot of free time. What else? Is there anything else you do?
Well, all that had to be put aside when I started the county job.
Of course.
But the board was kind enough to let me keep my interest in hen-house brewing.
And you are that's the other thing. That's my favorite part. You are actually a part owner of Hen House Brewing Company.
Yeah, so a passive investor, but also kind of informal counselor to Shane and Colin that run the organization.
Well, one of my favorite local breweries.
Yeah,
let me be upfront about that. And I should just throw in there that in your spare time, you do a lot of running. You've run marathons, compete in endurance sports. I don't know how you find time for any of that. I can barely get in my 20 minutes of exercise in my job. So.
Well, and both of our jobs here at the county require a lot of us, so I've had to scale back, and it's actually been enjoyable for the most part, running and cycling for joy, and that's it.
Yeah.
No longer competition.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very therapeutic and does help me to process my days to get out and move. That's right. It's a great church. Well, so one of the biggest initiatives the county is undertaking now and will continue to undertake is the general plan update. And I know sometimes people get kind of bored when that kind of term comes up, but this is probably the most important document we have as a county, right? Tell the public what it is all about and why it's important that they be involved.
So the California Supreme Court once described it as the land use constitution of the community.
Land use constitution, good. Yeah.
And I don't think that vaulted its importance at all.
Mm-hmm.
It really is the benchmark that we use for evaluating any policy initiative as it relates to land use. There are a number of elements that are required under state law, some that have to be updated according to a certain time schedule, and some that are more elective.
Mm-hmm.
So we've just gone through a process of the board of identifying some new initiatives that we want to undertake, when we're going to do it, and what type of community engagement we're going to have around the subject.
Well, there's so many integral components of it, right? It's like, where are we going to build housing? Where are we going to allow housing?
Yep.
How dense is it going to be? What kind of road infrastructure do we want to provide? What kind of transportation systems do we want to create or envision in the future? All these things really delve into establishing our quality of life as residents of this county.
They do, and we don't do this in a vacuum. Fortunately, our predecessors, dating back to the 80s, spent a lot of time in public discourse and debate and argument around how the county should look.
Mm-hmm.
And we were one of the first in this region, in fact, the state, to say that we really want our cities to have their own identity.
Right.
So many of us, public sector, private sector, were involved in establishment of urban growth boundaries around all of our cities, with a supporting policy framework from the county that locks in where urban development should go.
Yeah.
And then the voters also approved open space and agricultural preservation district that acquires either fee or easement interests in properties, and establish community separators that allow one to know when you're leaving Petaluma and enjoying our open space before you get to Cotati, and those same kind of buffers that exist amongst all the cities. We also all have general plans in the 9 cities in the county that focus on city-centered growth, especially transit-oriented growth around our smart rail systems. Yeah. So all that framework is there, and yet we still have a whole lot more to do in a new general plan.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you bringing that up because, those urban growth boundaries are so important in establishing our quality of life and what we value here. I mean, we sometimes I fear we take it for granted, but whenever we go to some place like in the Lower Bay Area or LA, and you drive along and you don't really, there's no break between going from San Carlos to Belmont to Redwood City to, but up here we made that a priority. Our
That's right.
public said this is our priority, and we did that through the general plan, among other documents. Correct?
Correct. And we're not perfect. We've had the legacy of rural sprawl that we're still dealing with today through a number of our policy initiatives. But I think that framework that I just described earlier really is the dominant one.
Yeah. And we still have mandates and needs. We still need to provide housing. We have mandates from the state to create space for housing. And so those things are on, we have to figure out in this new general plan, right?
That's correct.
Yeah. Well, so how long does that take? How long is that whole process?
Depends on the jurisdiction and the scope of the plan and the level of community engagement. With this board, we know we're going to have tons of community engagement. And we've received direction from them on some of the elective elements we're going to do. One of which is a tribal element, it'd probably be the first of its kind in California. But we've formed, I think, really good constructive relationships with our tribal partners, and it's time to provide a framework so we can move from a more transactional type of relationship, whether it's a casino agreement or, unfortunately, a desecration, to something more lasting. And deepen that relationship that we have. I mean, these were the first people on the land. I think they command a certain amount of attention, and they deserve it. And then we have new challenges around water and groundwater and the use of the Russian River. So there's no shortage of environmental and social issues with which we have to deal. Obviously, we have an incredible shortage of housing. That this, fortunately, is for the most part, a pro-housing community. And yet we run into a lot of opposition to housing projects, some of which I completely understand, some of which we have to just face truth to power and say, we have to have this housing here if you expect our economy to continue to evolve. And our children,
we want them to come back and live here someday. Yeah,
we have raised four daughters in this community. Two have all have done well. Two have struggled to stay here in the county and find a place to live. Two have found housing that they can own outside of the community.
Yeah.
And every time I take a plane from here to Portland to go visit our younger daughters, I see people from my own neighborhood.
Yeah. I hear you. I have a son who's an engineer, just graduated, and
Congratulations.
And I have a daughter who's studying to be a teacher. She craves being a teacher, but both of them struggle with fear that they'll never be able to come back and live in Sonoma County.
I understand that.
And I'm certainly hopeful that we can find a place for both, because we need both.
We do.
But I want to talk a little bit about the public's ability to have influence and give feedback on this plan to help it in its development. Where are those points going to be in this process?
There'll be many different modes and many different points.
Okay.
The last general plan represented what public engagement looked like in the 80s and 90s. And that was a group of citizens who really cared about their county and were picked by county leaders, and they met in the middle of the day.
Kind of like a focus group?
Almost like a focus group. That's a good description. And I don't think that works for today's community needs. We have people on our staff who focus and specialize in community engagement, and our staff are constantly taking training in it themselves. And we do not plan from inside our building. We go out into the community. So we do pop-ups and specific plan areas where we're proposing a plan. We'll do the same for the general plan. We will be going to church and school a lot on weekends and in evenings because we know that's where we'll find people
Hmm.
and different voices than we've traditionally heard.
Yeah.
We will be engaging the public in at least 2 languages, in English and Spanish.
Fantastic. So it's a whole new model for how you're looking at bringing people into this process and having their
Yes.
voices heard. Yeah. Well, that's fantastic. Well, what's the best way for the public to know how they can stay abreast of what's going on?
The best way is check our website at permitsonoma.org. There'll be continuing informational postings there, and those will become more robust as the process proceeds.
Yeah.
Right now, we've received authority from the board to begin the general plan, and we're picked by county leaders, and they met in the middle of the day.
Kind of like a focus group thing.
Almost like
Yeah.
a focus group. That's a good description.
Just to recap, the board just got this whole process started. They just approved this, basically the launch in December, correct?
Anytime we take a major policy initiative forward, the board wants to key in first and let us know their initial thoughts, which we appreciate when we work for them.
Sure.
Obviously, we work for the people of Sonoma County, but we look to them for the initial policy guidance.
Yeah.
And so they gave us a sense of scope, of timing, and then some of the specific policy measures they want us to pursue.
Yeah. Well, once again, best place, go on permitsonoma.org for the latest updates. They actually have a window. You can plug in your email address and be on the email list so you can be notified when these opportunities come up. So
that's right.
So thank you for that summary. Well, you mentioned the tree ordinance. Could you explain a little bit more about what the tree ordinance is and what we're hoping to get after there?
So the tree ordinance, the county has one now. I think has been acknowledged as being pretty permissive, and it dealt primarily with builders who wanted to take out a tree and what they could do to mitigate that tree loss if they did. But it left all the decision making to the builder instead of a better policy grounding.
Right.
So we have gone through a nearly 2 to 3 year process of not only strengthening the oak woodland ordinance that had preserved trees such as the valley oak that is so important to our the habitats in our valleys and scenic values, but also strengthening the tree ordinance itself to say that you should first avoid tree loss and then focus on mitigation. But then also acknowledge the extraordinary experience we've had with 4 megafires.
Right.
And so how do you balance vegetation management with tree preservation?
Right.
So that's required us to hire people like foresters who can engage most constructively with the forestry community and the environmental community to strike that balance.
Yeah.
And I think we are almost there.
Yeah.
Because we're doing both successfully, but how do we at a policy level reconcile the two?
Right.
And we next touch base with the board on 5 March. And then I think after that, we'll receive my inkling is the board will give us a little bit more direction, and then we'll finalize it this spring.
Well, the goal here is we want to protect our trees, particularly our heritage trees, right?
Yep.
The ones that really define the character of this county. And in some cases, some of our fines for removing a tree without proper permitting, some would argue, were too low, and that it was much easier for a builder, construction guy to just take it out and then pay the price afterward. And so we want to make that a little more challenging, while at the same time recognizing that sometimes, unfortunately, we do need to take out trees that are scarred or damaged in a storm. We've had some of those cases recently.
Nature's been doing it on a big scale to all of us, haven't it, folks?
Yeah. So let me just ask this on that note: if somebody's tree is partly damaged in a storm, and they have a tree guy come out and say, yeah, we need to take this tree down. Do they then have to pay a fine for that, or how does that
No,
work?
so we had this instance come up in the last storm. It was out in Guerneville. I won't mention the address, but we heard a report that there was a very large redwood tree not only crossing over a creek, but about to land on a home.
Oh,
And not surprisingly, the person didn't want to leave her home.
right.
And yet we had an obligation to protect her personal safety and the general public's.
Yeah.
So fortunately, we have Robert Aguero, our forester, in-house. We got a radio call from our building inspector who placed a restricted use or a yellow tag on the house. And then we had the tree quickly evaluated and were able to work out. So the person actually temporarily did have to leave her house. We had part of the tree removed. And the advantage of having a registered forester in Permit Sonoma is they checked with Fish and Wildlife
They got it all
at
done.
the state and federal level and said, we're going to take this tree out and we're going to authorize it. And we'll deal with the after effects later.
Huh.
So you can't do that as a private
Right.
individual and get fast action.
Yeah.
So we were able to do that. I mean, literally within about 90 seconds, radio to go ahead. And then the tree service did what they had to do. They're actually able to save part of the tree and make sure the creek over which it hung before it got to the house was minimally impacted. So that was a very successful example of how we can
That's great.
balance
What a great story. Yeah.
all the interests
Yeah.
involved.
One thing I want to point out that I appreciate about you is, when storms are happening, you get your raincoat on, your boots on, you're out there
Middle of the night.
in the middle of the night going along. I mean, I hear stories about, oh yeah, tennis is out here already. And I'm like always impressed by that. So
I think it's part of the job.
Mhm.
And if we, as you and I've talked about in emergency operations, if we don't get that part of the job right,
Yeah.
nothing else we do matters. If we don't have the public's health and safety forefront in our minds, that's where we have the chance to provide the best service and develop the most trust.
right.
So
Yeah.
sometimes it is
On the fly.
on the fly early on a Sunday morning after bars have closed and someone has driven into yet another building.
Mm.
And someone has to go out and make a quick structural evaluation of a building.
Right.
So
Because they can't wait till Monday.
Nope.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's great. Well, let's also talk about the other crisis we face in addition to flooding, but with the fires. And I know that was that's been a big part. You've been director at Permit Sonoma for 10 years, a little over 10 now, and you were there at the helm all through the fires, and you really helped that push to rebuild this community after the 2017 fires. You look back on that. How do you grade the county's efforts in doing that, and what you learned from that process?
Well, I don't think any one of us would give ourselves a passing grade at the beginning of the 2017 fire. Unfortunately, we learned a lot through that process. I think a lot of us grew in that position. And then as we progressed, we got better and better at response. In the 2019 fire and the two fires of 2020. And then several of us have been out on mutual aid since then. I've recently been in Maui County working with that community in its fire recovery. And I bring back a lot of ideas. It's not just bringing our experience there. But the biggest thing I would want to convey to the public is, there was a moment when a number of Permit Sonomans were working middle of the night in the Emergency Operations Center, and Ben Nichols came in to check on us. And Ben's
From the fire,
the chief CAL FIRE, who was born and raised in the Russian River Valley. And we began the discussion of it. How do we get out of this response? How do we get in front of this and learn to live with wildfire? And from that came a discussion and a strategy that we turned into the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities application, the great leadership of Carol Leon Stafford and John Mack and others in our organization. And we're able to secure that grant personally from President Biden and are now implementing it.
Mm.
And that gives me solace that we were able to learn from our experience and our mistakes, um,
And
and
improve
are
upon it.
now improving upon them with wildland assessments and helping people deal with structural hardening, defensive space from the structure out, and from on the wildland in, preserving fire cuts, um, working with tribal partners on cultural burns, working with fire experts and foresters on prescribed burns, and working with our fire professionals on mechanical and hand vegetation management, so that we are working uh, the problem and the solution from the building out and the wildland in.
I'd love to walk through that whole process of those years. That we'll have to save that for another
Sure.
episode where we just kind of go into the weeds on that. But that whole time and what you learned and how the process has changed is fascinating to me. And I think the community has really benefited from that. I mean, you look at how much we still have work to do, obviously, but you think about how much we have rebuilt. I want to talk real briefly. You mentioned about going to Maui. Do you see a lot of similarities between what Maui's experiencing right now and where we were 6 years ago, 5 years ago?
Yes, as far as community fatigue. And so they're right at the cusp of starting their rebuilding process. But it obviously came as a surprise to their community, much as it did here, but even more so. And then you add on that the complexity of Maui as its own distinct culture within the Hawaiian Islands, and then the legacy of colonialism, and tourism development versus housing for local residents. It's an incredibly complicated landscape, but fortunately, they're getting a lot of assistance from the same people that helped us, like Bob Fenton, who is the regional administrator for Region 9 for FEMA, who has essentially moved to the island to oversee the recovery process. And then a lot of just a really robust community. It's traditionally been a small government community, so there's just and it's an island in the middle of the ocean.
Right.
So they are a very resilient people and love to feed visitors, and couldn't be kinder.
Yeah. Well, I just wonder if also, I mean, it was interesting because the New York Times just came out with they just released a detailed analysis of where the deaths occurred in that fire that came through. And so many, I think there were 39 that actually died in their cars or near out in the street. And it just raises questions about what we can learn about circulation patterns and escape, ingress, egress during those hard to reach area, that they were cornered. There was really no alternative. And it's heartbreaking.
They're fortunate to have a lot of people. Curtis Brown is former CAL FIRE Red Cap, and he is the #1 assistant to Bob Fenton over there. So he brings all the experience that we have from here and from Paradise and other parts of California, the Dixie Fire, around evacuation, especially in geographies like canyons where maybe there's before the fire only one way in and one way out.
Well, I'll be fascinated to learn more about that as we go along.
Their whole rebuilding, and maybe we could talk next time about some of the ideas we're bringing back here around Ohana and multi-generational housing.
Yeah, I would love to hear more about that. Well, if you don't mind taking a minute, what other big projects do you have coming down the pike this year in 2024 at Permit Sonoma?
Well, we're going to be finishing up a couple of specific plans, one out at the airport area, and that includes a nearly 2,000 unit residential project. And then our building areas our business parks are really the economic engines for our economy. So it's important to make sure they have the services they need and aren't encroached upon, because they also tend to have the most affordable land values. So people are constantly wanting to convert industrial land to other uses. And then we have the Sonoma Developmental center specific plan for,
Huge. Yeah.
and we have the spring specific plan. So our goal is to get all three of those done as close to the end of this calendar year. So as we begin and get into the substance of the general plan, those are adopted and being implemented.
Well, as always, Tennis, there's always more to talk about than we have time. And we're going to have you back to dive into some of those issues more specifically. But we just first want to thank you for being our guest. And for being our guest, we'd like to give you one of our SoCo Chat mugs.
Very cool.
I think you'll be the first in Permit Sonoma to have one. So
cheers.
And to our listeners, we'd also like to give you a chance to win one of our SoCo Chat mugs. Be the first person to submit a correct answer to this week's trivia contest, and we will make sure you receive one. Our question this week is this. In our second episode of SoCo Chat, we interviewed Diva Marie Proto, Sonoma County's clerk, recorder, assessor, and, of course, registrar of voters. During our discussion, she mentioned Sonoma County has one of the highest voter turnouts in the state. Our question to you is this. What was the total voter turnout in Sonoma County for the total 2020 presidential election? Once again, we're looking for what was the total turnout of registered voters in Sonoma County for the presidential election in November 2020. If you know, email your answer to publicaffairs@sonoma-county.org. That's public affairs, one word, @sonoma-county.org. And please be sure to include your phone number so we can let you know if you won. Also, if you have any other comments about this or any other segment, or have a suggestion about a future SoCo Chat discussion, please send it to us at your ideas. Please send them to us at that address, Sonoma, publicaffairs@sonoma-county.org. And as for you all, we hope you continue to follow SoCo Chat on Spotify, Apple Podcast, Amazon, and of course, YouTube. And we'll see you next time. Thank you, Tennis.
Thanks, Paul.